Welcome to the October 3rd meeting of the Rotary Club of Louisville. I'm Lori Hudson Flannery, CEO of New Directions, President of our club, and Paul Harris Fellow. At this time, I will invite up Ann Monell. Ann will be providing our invocation today. She's the Executive Director of the Legacy Foundation of Kentuckiana and a Rotary Fund Board Director.
Thank you, President Lori. Please join me in a moment of reflection. As we gather as members and guests of Rotary, we are grateful for this day, for its blessings, its opportunities, as well as its challenges. Let us be a source of hope and comfort for those who are in need. Let us especially remember those whose lives and communities have been upended by Hurricane Helene. May we find courage in the face of fear or uncertainty, and give us discernment to know when not to be silent. Let us be united in purpose and not divided by differences, remembering first to seek to understand, then to be understood. Let us place service above self in our daily endeavors, and may our conversations today build trust and community as we work together to further the common good.
Thank you, Ann. I'm going to invite up now Julie Schmidt to lead us in the pledge and the four-way test. Julie is Senior Director of External Affairs for KET, past club president and one of the best club presidents, best darn presidents ever, and Paul Harris Fellow ×1.
Fellow Rotarians, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, and now please join me for the Rotary four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Julie. This is a reminder for everyone, if you have a device with you, a phone or another electronic device, if you will please make sure you turn it off. Make sure you turn it off or silence it for the remainder of the meeting. I appreciate that. Now it's time for our guest introductions. I know we have a lot of guests today. So if you will please, Rotarians, if you'll please come up to this microphone to my right and to your left, introduce yourself first, then your guest or multiple guests. Make sure that you have their name and their title and affiliation if they have one. And guests, if you hear your name, if you will please stand up briefly so the club can identify who you are. Thank you.
Hello, Madam President. I am Sandra Dodge, and I'm so pleased to have my son, Brian Dodge, here with us today. Brian is in the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley, and he's visiting with his wife for a few days, and we've been enjoying a lot of bourbon and a lot of Rotary. Thank you.
Good morning. I have with me today Karen Fallon. She's our development director. I'm Maria Smith, CEO of Harbor House. And Karen's with me with Harbor House as well. So welcome, Karen.
Hi, I'm Steve Runworth. I have with me my friend Steve Weidman. He's moved to Louisville about 2 years ago. He's a retired commercial banker. Welcome, Steve. Thank you.
Hi, Madam President. Chris Garrett with Big Brothers Big Sisters. Today I have with me our CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters, Gary Friedman, who I think a lot of you probably already know, but there he is.
Our President Lori Amy Luttrell, CEO for Goodwill of Kentucky, and I have with me Adam Haley right here, who is our Director of Policy and Strategy.
Good afternoon, President Lori, I'll turn your mic back on as soon as I get back over there. My name is Delene Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Downtown Rotary Club of Louisville, the 13th largest club in the world, and I have some guests with us today. First, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Glazer back from last week. She is a teacher and head of the Business and Finance Academy at Silver Creek High School, and she brought her husband with her, Lawrence. Welcome, both of you. Is Brent here today? Did my guest Brent make it? Oh, hi, there you are, Brent. I'm not sure if I'm saying your last name right. Is it Bednarik? All right. He is the president of SIGO Enterprises and reached out to us through the internet. So welcome to Rotary. I hope you have a great experience. Are there any other guests today that have not been introduced yet that I missed? All right. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Hold tight.
So I'm going to introduce my guest, and then Delene's going to help me turn my microphone back on. My guest is Kurt Mason. Thank you, Delene. Kurt Mason, if you'll please stand. He is a recently retired senior executive of 44 years with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, serving Kentucky. He is a previous chair of Burnham Forest, and I'm kind of glad he stepped down, even though that's one of my favorite places in Kentucky, because once he did, he agreed to be chair of my organization, New Directions. So welcome, Kurt Mason. Guests, at the end of our session today, you will hear me ring the bell, and that will be the sign that the meeting has concluded. If you will then make your way over to this table, to my right, to your left in the corner, there's a sign on top of the table that says, "What is Rotary?" You'll spend just a few minutes. This gentleman that's standing up right now, longtime Rotarian, Craig Sherman, will give you just a little snippet about what our Rotary Club is all about. And we always say, if you don't know it, we are the 13th largest Rotary Club in the world. So we got something to talk about. We want to allow as much time as possible for questions today, so I would encourage you to read Sparks. I believe Delene sent that out yesterday. It is chock full of information about what's going on with our club. You'll find dates and times and all different kinds of things to look at. We had some Rotarians in the spotlight, and also wanted to note that club members were afforded an opportunity to submit their questions up front. We went through the process with the speakers committee to take those questions and consolidate them. As you might imagine, some of the questions were similar, and so if you don't hear your exact question, it might be an amalgamation. Instead of our usual of having Rotary members come up to the microphone after our speaker and asking their own personal questions, we're going to have members of the speakers committee ask those questions for you all. So thank you for adhering to that. Now it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, U.S. Senator Rand Paul. Elected to the United States Senate in 2010, Senator Paul is an outspoken champion for constitutional liberties and fiscal responsibility. He is the third of 5 children, born to Carol and Ron Paul. He grew up in Lake Jackson, Texas, and attended Baylor University. He graduated from Duke Medical School in 1988. Senator Paul completed a general surgery internship at Georgia Baptist Medical Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and completed his residency in ophthalmology at Duke University Medical Center. Upon completion of his training in 1993, Senator Paul moved to Bowling Green to begin his ophthalmology practice. He's a devoted father of 3 and has been married for over 33 years to Kelly Ashby Paul of Russellville, Kentucky. Senator Paul founded the Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic, an organization that provides eye exams and surgery to needy families and individuals. He's a former president and 17-year member of Lions Club International, which is dedicated to preserving sight by providing eyeglasses and surgery to the less fortunate around the world. Sounds like a Rotarian to me. In recognition of his outstanding and sustained efforts to provide vision care to Kentuckians in need, Lions Club International has awarded Senator Paul many of its highest commendations. During his free time, Senator Paul currently performs pro bono eye surgeries for patients across Kentucky. Additionally, he provides free eye surgery to children from around the world. Most recently, he traveled to Guatemala and Haiti on a medical mission trip. During his time in Guatemala and Haiti, over 200 patients, many of them blind with cataracts, had their vision restored. Senator Paul.
Lori mentioned that the resume sounded kind of like Rotary Club, and I was reminded when I first moved to Bowling Green, it said, why don't you join a civic group? And so I went to the Rotary group. It was a singing Rotary, and they had a tryout, and I had to sing, and when I was finished with my audition, they said, well, Lions Club doesn't require singing. But no, it's good to be here. Now you're 13th biggest. How many members do you need to get to be 12th biggest?
Well, we're looking at that right now.
All right, well, let me know if I can help it anyway. I have 5 million people on Twitter. I don't know if we just want to put out a message. You're looking for members.
Yes.
I have good news for you and bad news. The good news is, unequivocally, according to historical standards, never been a better time to be alive. Put it in perspective, longevity, disease, childhood illness, you name it, never been a better time to be alive. I'm reading a book right now talking about little snippets of each of the presidents, and invariably about half their kids die in childhood, Mortality for childhood illness around 1900 is about somewhere between 30 and 50%. People had 12 kids. One, they need a lot of kids for a farm, but they had 12 kids because 4 of them would survive if they were lucky. Reminds me of, I think it was Edward III had like 13 kids and 12 of them lived to be maturity. And now, if you trace your DNA back, not in this country, but if you trace your DNA in England, it's like 98% of England is related to him through DNA. Within about a generation or two, he had like 450 descendants, because they all survived, but it was extraordinarily unusual. But if you look at any sort of metric, you find that never been a better time to be alive. And the reason I point that out is if you watch the broadcast news, if you watch television, read the newspaper, you hear Sturm and Drang, you hear terrible things happen. And there are terrible things. I'm not saying there's not bad things happening, but if you put them in perspective, disease, longevity, violence, it's actually at a lower ebb than ever in the history of mankind. There's a group called humanprogress.org that looks at prosperity. They're an offshoot of Cato. And one of the charts that they put out, there's a psychologist from New York University named Jonathan Haidt, and he says it's the most important graph ever produced. It's a graph of GDP per person. And you see it, and it goes along the x-axis for most of human history. About 1820, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith's capitalism, wealth of nations, and the beginning of capitalism, you see it turn. It's basically a hockey stick. It goes up. Particularly after World War II, as we got more and more international trade. The reason I bring this up is that trade now doesn't have a good name. There are other names they call trade by, but it doesn't necessarily have a good name from both parties. We have a growing impulse to nationalism and protectionism in the Republican Party, but also being mirrored in the Democrat Party. We have this fear of others, this fear of people who don't look like us owning stuff in America. That is, unless you live in Georgetown and you're one of the 15,000 people working for Toyota that understand that Japan is no longer our enemy. But you would think people would know that. And yet one of the big policy decisions that's coming out of this administration, really at the behest of pressure from Trump and Vance, is to ban the sale of U.S. steel to Nippon Steel. It's done out of fear of others, fear of other countries. Somehow it's going to be terrible for America if Japan owns the largest steel company. Well, you know what might be worse for America? Is having no steel company if it goes bankrupt. Or here, is it fair to the people who own U.S. Steel or even to the workers? I don't know what the price tag is, but let's say it's $1 billion. But if you tell them Nippon Steel can't buy it, what do you think? It's worth more or less now? What if it sells for $800 million? You just stole $200 million worth of value. Some of that's going to go to workers, some's going to go to management, some of that's going to go to stockholders. But it's this idea that we can't let the Japanese own things. This happened back in the 80s and we sort of got over it. Japan's a great ally. They own Jim Beam, for goodness sakes. We're not too concerned. I'm not too concerned that they own stuff in our country. In fact, I like that they own stuff in our country because it interconnects us and makes us better friends. People say, what about China? We hate the Chinese communists. Well, I'm not a big fan of Chinese communism. I've written 2 books criticizing them. The Case Against Socialism, where I wasn't too happy or friendly with Mao, what Mao did over a 20 or 30 year period, starving his people and trying to push socialism on that led to the utter devastation of the culture wars. And yet, I don't think I want to cut off trade with them. Look, I wrote another book recently called Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up, where I think the virus came from China. I think they covered it up. I think our government was complicit in that, and yet, I still don't want to cut off trade with them. For the same reason that I don't want to cut off trade with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia dismembered a journalist, Khashoggi, dropped his body parts out of a plane. I don't want to have dinner necessarily with them. I don't necessarily want to give them any more weapons. In fact, I've led the fight not to sell them more weapons. But I don't want to cut off trade with them. Why? Because trade is mutually beneficial. If I want to trade with any of you in this audience, if you sell a service, you're a plumber, you sell HVAC, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, and I buy your services, I only give you my money if I want your services more than I want my money. You give me your services because you want my money more than you want to keep the services to yourself. That's what it is. It's a win-win. Trade is always a win-win, as long as you're not being forced to buy something or forced to take something. We've sort of lost that. We think somehow it's a net loss. And people say, well, we have a trade deficit with China. You know, I got a trade deficit with my grocery store. I probably buy $50,000 worth of groceries. They don't buy crap from me. And it means absolutely nothing. Does anybody know what the trade deficit is with Ohio? Nobody cares. It's a form of nationalism, but nobody cares. Does it mean I don't care about American industries? No. But there are ways to help American industry. We could lower your taxes. We could lessen your regulations. There's a lot of things we could do. We could have a sound dollar to make things predictable. Try not to have so much inflation. A lot of things we could do for American industry. But subsidizing is not the answer either. People say, well, we're going to defeat the Chinese communists by behaving like the Chinese communists. They subsidize their industry. We're going to subsidize our industry. There's a big difference between giving industry a tax cut versus giving it money. So, for example, at the risk of getting the enmity of someone in the semiconductor industry, giving them money was a bad idea. We give them $100 billion. Well, why don't we give them a tax deduction? Why don't we lower their taxes, lower their regulatory burden? But giving money to Intel makes no sense at all. Anybody here feel compelled that they're worried about Intel's health when you should give them money? I mean, this is sort of crazy. And the difference between a tax deduction and a subsidy is this. If I give everybody in the semiconductor industry or any industry a deduction, it's only of any value to you if you make profit, right? So you still have to be good at it, and you'll get more of the deduction the more profit you make. But if I give you a subsidy, I have no idea whether you're good at it. We've tried this. They're still trying this in the green energy, you know. They gave Solyndra, several years ago, $500-600 million, and it was basically squandered because they didn't know what they were doing and they went out of business. We shouldn't be in the business of picking the winners and losers. But ultimately, we need to understand the benefits of trade. Adam Smith first wrote about this. People did even before Adam Smith, but in a big way in 1776 with The Wealth of Nations. One of the big subjects, if you read it, is the division of labor. And it was the explanation that the division of labor is how capitalism takes off. It allows innovation, it allows people to have more time to create things and discover things because they have more spare time. If I've got to make my shoes, make my clothes, make my food, if I've got to make everything, I don't have time to sit around and think of a great idea for, the cotton gin or something like that. Leisure and innovation and discovery comes from the division of labor. And in the beginning, the division of labor is Everybody in Louisville makes their shoes, and then one or two people make all the shoes for all of Louisville. Then you decide, well, gosh, labor's cheaper over in the backwater like Lexington, and we're not on tape, are we? And so then the shoes go to Lexington for a while. Now they're in Vietnam, they make the shoes, and people think, oh, it's so terrible. Why can't we make shoes in America anymore? It's like, well, because we make the shoes in Vietnam, because we have international trade, you have $7,000 more than you had 20 years ago. International trade makes the average American $7,000 richer. Just trade with China, $1,500 richer. So we sort of just got to figure out a way to get beyond sort of fear of others and fear of international trade. To me, this will be one of the defining issues as we move forward. And if you think it's going to help you in this election, it probably won't. Most of the tariffs and sanctions against China remained under the Biden administration. The whole idea of going after Nippon Steel was more of a Trump-Vance thing, but it's being enacted by the Biden administration now. Nippon Steel, the first even before they started hearing about it, I was hearing about it from people who transport coal in Kentucky, metallurgical coal. Nippon Steel's already a purchaser of them. So Nippon Steel already indirectly is helping us with jobs in Eastern Kentucky by buying metallurgical coal that's used in the production of steel. But we have people who want to shut it down. We also have people who have decided they want to break up industry. Industry's too big, so they're trying to break up Google now. And look, I'm not a fan of Google. I mean, I think Google is about as far left-wing as you get. People like me who want to express my opinion, I think they downgrade me. I think they use an algorithm to suppress conservative ideas. And yet, I believe in the First Amendment more than I believe in retribution. So I don't want to break up Google. Plus, it's a nonsensical idea that's being put forward. This is the idea that's being put forward more by Democrats, but also some Republicans as well, that big is bad, and that it doesn't matter whether you control the price. It doesn't matter what happens to your consumer. Just a matter, if you're too big, and we ought to break you up. This has gotten away from the traditional theory of antitrust, which is called the consumer welfare model. If you want to say someone's a monopoly, you have to say, well, my price for buying their product, they're controlling it, and the price is up here, and they completely control the price, and they're gouging the consumer. Most of the history of antitrust is not that. Most of the history of antitrust is actually disgruntled consumers using antitrust to break up somebody who's superior to them. Sometimes it's even worse than that. It's the third and fourth biggest company combining and merging. They say, oh, you can't merge. Well, they're still smaller than the second, third, and first biggest company, and then we prevent them from merging. We've got to get away from a lot of this stuff. With Google, do I think they're left-wing? Yes. Do I think they do some crazy things? Recently, there was if you began typing in TRU assassination, you got Truman's assassination, and they were downgrading the Trump assassination. It's a political thing. They were doing it for political reasons. YouTube took down some of my stuff during COVID when I said cloth masks don't work, which they don't. And they took that down. But do I want to break up YouTube or force them to take my content? No, it's a free country. I can go somewhere else. I went to another location for social media. But we have to get away from this idea that we're going to break them up. Some of it's nonsensical too. They say, well, Google has 80% of the search engine ads. It means absolutely nothing. Do you think a search engine ad is different than another ad that's on the computer? Or a billboard or a newspaper ad or a TV ad? They all compete with each other. There's lots of computer ads. Just because you control the online ads or you have more of them, unless you can show that they're raising the price, are they really doing something harmful? And yet we're using that as the means to break them up. But then you say, well, we love America. We want our companies to do well. Well, if you break up American big tech, who do you think is going to replace them? Someone from another company, another country. U.S. Steel, part of the reason U.S. Steel was weakened after decades and decades was antitrust action against U.S. Steel because they were too big. And yet, for the most part, if you look at the prices of the things they were selling, it wasn't that they were able to control the price. If we don't come to our senses on understanding that trade is good, that the division of labor has made us wealthier, we're going to continue to react. It'll be a reactionary policy that we have to cripple big companies, often that will be American, and then we're going to cripple trade in the process, and I think in the end, we're all going to be less fortunate for it. In the long term, I have a great deal of optimism when you place this historically. It's important to understand that because we can't dwell on and succumb to this notion that woe is me, it's a terrible world, it's worse than it's ever been. It's the opposite. The world is the best it's ever been in every metric you can measure, including racism, including violence, you name it. Everything you can possibly imagine that you think might be getting worse is actually better in historical terms. If you look simply at prosperity, in the 1820s, and you're coming along the x-axis, 98% of people lived in abject poverty, less than $2 a day. Using the same measurement and controlling for inflation, when I was born in the early 1960s, about a third of people lived in abject poverty. So we went from 98%, virtually everyone in abject poverty, to about a third. Fast forward, as international trade being the main driving force of this continued, today less than 10% of the world, not America, less than 10% of the world. We're including sub-Saharan Africa, we're including Bangladesh, some of the poorest places in the world, but less than 10% of the population lives in this abject poverty. It's from trade. People say, well, why can't you get together? There, unfortunately, is bipartisanship in Washington. It's just bipartisanship for the wrong things. So right now there's a bipartisan protectionist movement going on. There's a bipartisan movement to send our monies overseas and be involved in wars. There are occasionally some bipartisan things that happen that are for the better. Some of those we've talked about in Louisville before. Some of them are criminal justice reform. You've seen some of that at the state legislature. You've seen that in Washington. Some of that still continues. People talk about a right-left continuum, or right-left come back together. There is some right and left. Many of the bills that I've put together have been with Cory Booker, some with Kamala Harris, and some with other members on the Democrat side. I think the most recent one, the Clean Slate Act, is with Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. And people ask me about that. He's up for election now. Do you want to do anything? He's up for election. I said, well, no, we're for this. We've been for this for a long time. So there is some bipartisanship. There used to be bipartisanship on arms control. Now there's almost none. We don't really talk to China much. We don't talk to Russia anymore. Everybody is so involved in the Ukraine war. And of course, my sympathies are with Ukraine, and Russia is in the wrong. But Russia still has, 1,500 intercontinental nuclear-tipped missiles. Shouldn't we be talking to them about arms control? We've backed away from agreements. They've gotten out of agreements. People say it's their fault. They say it's our fault. We need to be having conversations. The Chinese have about a third as many nuclear weapons as we have, and we have really no conversations with them. These are difficult conversations. I'm not saying I have the answer that if we sat down with China, all of a sudden we'd figure out, but somebody should be having these conversations. Recently, when the Chinese president came over to San Francisco, there was some discussion of deconfliction. This is sort of having the ability to call your counterpart if there's a potential accident. In the movie Reagan recently, they showed the episode, and I think it was from 1983, where the Russians really thought we were launching a nuclear attack against them. It turned out it was a flock of pigeons or something, or geese or something that had set off a warning. It was heightening to a dangerous alert. When I was in Pearl Harbor not too long ago, I was talking to the head of the Pacific Fleet for us, and he says, we used to be able to talk to Chinese generals. We had their cell phone number. These are important things. They don't bring world peace. They don't mean we're all going to be automatically good friends. But when you want the generals that are in charge of detecting whether or not a nuclear attack is coming or whether we're going to respond to one in the next 2 minutes, to have a cell phone number to say, hey, whoever their Chinese counterpart is, what's going on here, and to have deconfliction bring the moment down. We don't do enough of that because we're just so angry all the time. And I think we need to have, rational criticism of communism and rational criticism of one-party rule, but I don't think we should divorce ourselves. If we tomorrow stop all trade from China, half your antibiotics you won't have. People say, it's terrible. They have a supply chain. I'm all for encouraging us to have more of the supply chain. I'm for tax breaks. I'm for regulatory reform. Let's make more stuff. It's not going to happen immediately, but I'm not for enforcing and saying we have to buy American, which means you have to pay twice as much for everything. I also think trade with China still interconnects us. It may not have made them a free and open place, but I think it is freer than it was under Mao, for instance. I think that there is room for both parties to figure out some of this, that we get too trapped in our camps, but there's also room for the public to understand that we actually have legitimate disagreements with each other. on taxes. In 2017, we voted to lower taxes, significantly lower rates, S corporation pass-through, immediate expensing, which I think is really important. If you build stuff, you buy a bulldozer and it costs $150,000, you can write it off that year. You write it off over 5 years, guess what? You wait 5 years to buy your next bulldozer. If you write it off in 1 year, you buy your next one the next year. I mean, things like this that we voted were completely partisan. Not one Democrat supported the tax bill. Tax bill is getting ready to expire because of our budgetary rules. It wasn't permanent. I don't think that'd be a good idea. You know, we're on opposite sides on that. How do we compromise? They want to raise taxes, we want to lower them. It's kind of hard to find in between. On regulations, I have a bill that would allow Congress to vote on regulations that cost over $100 million. And there are no Democrats on it. There are no Democrats in favor of Congress voting on regulations. In fact, regulations in general, if we said one side is for more and one side is for less, it's the reverse of the taxes. They're for more regulations and we're for less. How do we find in between? We used to have more bipartisanship in Washington, but there used to be conservative Democrats in Washington. Many of them were from the South, and many of them switched over and became Republicans. And so now people sort of are in their camps, and it's hard to find. I think there's still room for it, though. I think there's room for discussion. Nuclear arms control, international trade, criminal justice, and maybe even possibly on the budget. I learned this in the last year, didn't know this. Over half of the European Union balances their budget each year. I sat down and had lunch with the Swedish ambassador, and he was head of the Young Socialist League. He's from the Social Democrats. He's a socialist. And he sounded more conservative than every Democrat in Washington and half the Republicans. They balance their budget. On their pension plans, they don't blink an eye. They say if our economy goes down, we give people less than their pension. Their Social Security, you should get less. For a recession, instead of $2,200, you get $2,000. Just goes down. When do you get your pension? When do you get your old age pension? Depends on what the longevity index is. They're linked to a longevity index. All these things are common sense, and we should do too. They're bigger. They have bigger governments than we do. They have a lot higher taxes. So 2 ways you could get to balance. You could raise taxes on everybody. I think that would devastate the economy to raise taxes that much, or you could cut spending. And people say, well, how would you cut spending? Where will you cut? Name me one thing you will cut. And I was like, and someone asked me this on the floor of the Senate last week, and I said, well, we spent $1 million studying whether Japanese quail, if you give them cocaine, whether they're more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. I'd be okay with getting rid of that one. We spent $1.5 million studying whether or not if you take your cell phone and take a selfie while smiling, whether or not if you look at that later in that day, that makes you happier, better person. We spent $750,000 studying the mating call of the male Panamanian frog. And they wanted to know whether the mating call was different for the city than the country. And I said, everybody knows that. I've been to Louisville, I've been to the city, and I live in Bowling Green. The mating call is a lot different. But just ridiculous stuff like that. We have autism money, and you say, well, I have a child or a grandchild with autism. Government should be able to spend some money. I agree. I'm not for no money spent on anything, but spend it on autism. They took autism money, almost $1 million, and they gave a sub-grant to somebody who wanted to study whether or not, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, did he say one small step for man or one small step for a man? They spent $750,000 listening to those old crackly tapes. One small step. And in the end, they couldn't decide. So when they ask me for specific cuts, I give them dozens of these things. And those are the worst. And then their response is, oh, yours will add up to 1% of the budget. That's an honest critique of this. And I say, well, I would cut 1% of everything. I call it the petty plan. I just cut 1% of everything, including the entitlements. They said, oh, no, you wouldn't. I said, I would. I said, Medicare's $1 trillion. You don't think I could hire somebody to run Medicare? We got some hospital executives here. Our hospital executive, and Rick Scott has told me he could do it. He said 1% he could do like that, and you wouldn't reduce anybody's health care. Because there's just so much waste and inefficiency in government. They're not very good at anything. Why? It's not that they're dumb people, although sometimes that's debatable. It's that they don't get the right signals. If you're a hospital executive in Louisville, you have to look at a bottom line, if not weekly, monthly, or daily to see whether you're bringing in more than you're paying out. You have to look at a profit loss statement. Government doesn't do that. I guarantee you get 1% across the board and not even know it's gone. But there's some agencies I'd just get rid of. It'd be easier. I might not have got anything from Medicare if I got rid of the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation, every one of those behavioral studies. Here's another one. You're at Luby's and guy in front of you sneezes on the food. Are you more or less likely to take the food that someone just sneezed on? $2 million. Just stuff like that. They started out, William Proxmire was a conservative Democrat back in the 70s, and he started the Golden Fleece Award to make fun of these ridiculous things, mostly from the National Science Foundation. So one of his first ones was, it was $50,000 to study what makes people happy. And it's like, that's something maybe you could put in Cosmopolitan magazine and read about. Might be interesting. That's not something your tax dollars should go to. But my favorite one of his favorite ones was, they wanted to know which made people more aggressive, tequila or gin. So they had codfish, they had codfish, they fed codfish gin, and then they had codfish, I don't know how you feed, I don't know how you get fish to drink alcohol. Anyway, and then they fed the others tequila, and of course we all know the answer, it's gotta be tequila, right? But we doubled. The National Science Foundation, this last year, when we gave all the CHIPS money, to not only to Intel, we gave it to, it's supposed to be to help domestic chips manufacturers. A bunch of the money, like billions and billions, went to the Taiwan semiconductor company and to Samsung, our Korean semiconductor company. It's like, really? We're doing all this nationalism, we're going to promote American business, but we're voting too. I guess they do some business or make some of it here, but it's like, really? These are billion-dollar, if not trillion-dollar corporations. Do we really need to tax the middle class to give them some more money? But the budget, there are ways to look at it. And instead, though, what we get is there is a compromise, but the compromise is always to raise everything. There are two sort of factions. The Republicans are more blank check for the military. Democrats are more blank check for welfare. What is the compromise? They both get together and everybody gets what they want. So, and I'll sort of end with this because I could go on and on about this. There was a deal about a year ago. Remember McCarthy does this deal when he was still Speaker. It's why they got rid of him largely. But I had at least a little bit of sympathy for him in this deal. He says, well, you took entitlements off the table. That's 2/3 of spending. But he's right. We spend $6 trillion, $4 trillion is entitlement off the table. So he's only left with $2 trillion. About half of that's military. The Republicans insisted on taking that off the table and giving it a 3% increase. So entitlements are going up at 6 or 7% a year, which is where the real money is. Military, which is about $1 trillion now, almost $1 trillion, is going up now at 3% a year. So he's left with a half of a third. He's left with a sixth of government. Says, oh, do something with that. You can eliminate it all. And you only cut half of 1 year's deficit. And we're not going to eliminate it because Democrats like most of those programs that are in that remaining 1/6 of government. So they've all tied their hands behind their back by putting everything off limits. But there's all kinds of things. We used to agree that work was a good thing. I've said it before, not because I think I'm a mean person or an ogre. I think everybody that is physically able to work should not receive a check unless they work. I'm not for eliminating all the government checks. I would just say you have to work. And not because I'm a mean person, because I think that's the way you get your self-esteem. Nobody can give you self-esteem. Work is where it's at. This is what makes you a person, is to work. I don't know why we couldn't all agree to that, no matter what party we're in, that you should have to work for a check. It used to be able-bodied people didn't get checks anyway. I mean, food stamps was for moms with a bunch of kids who weren't able to work because they had all these kids to raise. And now you got a young 19-year-old male on food stamps. If we're going to do that, it should be for like 3 weeks until they get a job. I mean, there's so many great things going on. I'll mention one, and I know I'm going to quit here pretty soon. The tech school here in town, I went by there teaching people HVAC, electrician, all this different stuff. There's about 40 or 50 kids in there. Every one of them's tuition was paid for by a company, and every one of them had a job if they successfully completed the program. These things abound. The only thing I think we might do better is advertise them better to the kids in the school. Instead of once a year, twice a year going to school, I think there should be somebody there for 3 to 5 minutes every morning telling the kids how great these different jobs can be. Maybe that you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, maybe you're going to college, maybe you're doing this, but you can go to a technical school and have a great life. But we got to advertise that, push it somehow. Whenever I get depressed in Washington and say, oh my goodness, this place is completely insane, I try to put it in perspective that we are the greatest country in recorded history. We live at the best possible time, and I think it's our job to understand what made our country great, preserve that, and also to defend our individual liberty and our Constitution. And I consider that my job in your stead. Thank you very much.
And thank you for agreeing to have a few questions asked. I'm going to invite to the microphone now the members of the Speakers Committee so that they can present the questions that the members have put forth this week.
Senator Paul Ashley Brower with Next Strategic Communications. I'm also the speaker chair here, so thank you so much for being here today. One of the questions we received is we are seeing absolute devastation in North Carolina and Tennessee from Hurricane Helene, with people struggling just to survive. Secretary Mayorkas says FEMA doesn't have enough funding to last through hurricane season. Last year, Congress awarded DHS $640 million to help communities provide shelter and aid to people in the country illegally. Some would say that money was siphoned from the FEMA disaster relief funds. How do we reconcile this? And why aren't we seeing federal-led helicopter rescue missions in those hard-hit areas? We're seeing private citizens flying in and apparently getting threatened with arrest.
So the federal flood insurance program, like most things the government runs, doesn't work. It's completely inept and it's always out of money. Every 3 to 6 months we have to have an emergency infusion of cash. So this is a senator that stands up and he wants to do it unanimously, and I stand up and object. And the reason I object is this: I don't want to do it unless we fix the system, fix the reason why it's always out of money. So for example, he'll get up and say, I want to unanimously pass another $16 billion or $30 billion with the flood insurance. And I said, well, okay, but why don't we exclude anybody who has a second home that's insured by the government, or exclude just people whose second home is worth more than $500,000. They all get all crazy and mad at me and everything. It's like, really? We got a federal government that's always out of money and you want to insure people's second home that's worth $500,000? And you say, well, surely that can't be many people. Over half of the claims are for houses over $500,000. Look, I got nothing against rich people. I aspire to be a rich person. Nothing against them. But when we have limited resources, we're always out of money. Why don't we just quit insuring people's vacation homes? And yet we get nowhere on that. They never fix the program. They just give them more money. So this is sort of the history of this. Eventually there will be money, though. We will pay for the damage there. I can't account for why there isn't been a more immediate response, because I'm not really in charge of that. Here it was sort of a mixed bag. In a tornado in the eastern Kentucky, I think we did pretty well, and FEMA did okay. I would say that in our state, and this is a big contrast to the federal government, your state legislature here has done an amazing job in that there's a rainy day fund. So when we had the tornadoes hit western Kentucky and the floods hit eastern Kentucky, your state legislature wrote $200 billion to western Kentucky and $200 million to eastern Kentucky, like that, out of savings. That's what you're supposed to do. You know what the rainy day account is in Washington? Minus 35 trillion.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Thank you so much for being here. That was an awesome presentation you just gave us. My name is Kevin Fields. I'm CEO at Louisville Central Community Center and also the Secretary to the Club's Board of Directors. I do have a question for you. I want to preface it with a statement. American families are struggling with higher costs of groceries, gas, and other goods. And with the port strike, inflation could increase even more. Add to that crime and wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. So, who do you think would be the best fit for our next president?
Next question, please. See, I thought I was supposed to be a Rotary, and I've been trying so hard not to be political when you ask me that. You know, the thing is it's important to know what causes high prices. And so, and I don't think they quite got to the gist of this in the vice presidential debate the other night. High prices have a lot of causes. Supply and demand is part of pricing. But a big part of it is that we're having a diminishing value of the dollar. And that's that $35 trillion debt. So we're going to have a $2 trillion debt this year. About a third of that is bought by the public who buy treasury bills. A third is bought by foreign countries, but a third is bought by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve just prints it up. That's new money entering into circulation, and you get inflation. That inflation causes a general rise in all prices, some more than others, but it's part of it. War can have something to do with it. Vance was right. If you have 20,000 new citizens come to a city of 20,000, you're going to bid up the prices of rent and houses. But I didn't think they did a good enough job of explaining that the debt is what causes this. And to be fairly bipartisan, I will tell you on spending and debt, both parties are terrible. During the Trump administration, $8 trillion of debt was added. During the Biden administration, when it's all added up, about $8 trillion. It's going to be equal. I will say on my side, I do believe there's at least a little more willpower to wanting to slow down on the spending costs. At least some of us are vocal in that. On the other side, they believe in a modern monetary theory that there really aren't limits to borrowing. The only time they seem to be concerned is when they think that tax cuts are adding to the debt, which has been debated for a long time and is worth looking at. This was debated from the time of Reagan until the tax cut of 2017. Every tax cut in the last 30 years where we've cut the rates has brought in more revenue. Supply side economics works, the statistics are overwhelming, bringing more revenue. The reason we have deficits is we don't slow down on spending. And it's both parties, military for the Republicans, non-military for the Democrats, but it's spending that's the problem. On the spending issue, I think there would be more restraint on our side and probably less likely to have as much problem with inflation. We have to get to the fundamental understanding of this. For example, I don't want to mention any names, but Elizabeth Warren, she believes that your prices are high in the grocery store because the grocery store owners are greedy. I would fail her in third grade economics for that. I mean, the thing is you would have to suppose that they just became greedy. So they were never greedy and they just became greedy. Or like the homeowners and people in 2007, home prices were so high because they were greedy. No, it has to do with interest rates, it has to do with the supply of money, but it has nothing to do with greed. That's just a way of vilifying people. And so if you don't understand where inflation comes from and you want to blame people and call them greedy, that is just name calling. That really is of no value. And at least on our side, there are people who do understand that inflation comes from debt. You have to have less debt to have less inflation. That's a long-winded way to say I'm not voting for Harrison.
Senator Paul, thank you for being here. Dr. Rick Smith, I work at Simmons College of Kentucky, Louisville HBCU. You know me as Lawrence Smith's better-looking brother. The Surgeon General has declared gun violence a public health issue, and Kentucky has been cited for inadequate mental health resources. JCPS lost $30 million in funding due to discipline disparities for African American students. What are you doing to support Black communities and people of color in addressing these crises beyond arrest, to provide resources that help individuals and families thrive? How are you working to address gun violence in marginalized communities, both publicly and behind the scenes?
I think it's a good question because it does seem to be an issue and the public perceives it as an issue where we're at loggerheads and no progress can happen. I think we have to look for areas where we would have agreement. So for example, it's against the law for felons to buy weapons. The most recent guy that tried to kill President Trump was a felon. He wasn't supposed to buy a weapon. I don't know how they figured out, where he's gotten it yet. 90% of crimes and 90% of killings and woundings are done with stolen weapons. So the stolen weapons, we can try to prevent people from getting stolen weapons. With regard to felons, we have a list of who the felons are. There's about 100,000 felons each year that through the background checks are kicked out and don't buy a weapon. That's a felony. We prosecuted 13 last year out of 100,000. So I've talked to Mayor Greenberg about this. I've talked to state legislature about this. That's something I think there could be common ground, that there's already agreement on the checks that we have. This would be enforcing the checks to try to keep people who committed felonies from getting another weapon. That I think could have some purpose. When I mentioned it to Russell Coleman, and I hate to characterize other people when they're not here, but he had said they need more resources in the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, not Attorney General, the U.S. District Attorneys. But anyway, he thinks that there's not enough time. He says they're spending all their money and time prosecuting people who they call trigger pullers, the ones who actually committed murder, versus what they call paper crime. But I think we have enough resources that we can maybe prevent some of the murders from happening by trying to stop, some of the people from getting guns before they get them. How that applies to mental health, there have been talk, and there are some laws about trying to prevent people with mental health problems from having weapons. I think there has to be to my mind, you have a Second Amendment right to purchase a weapon. You have to have that taken from you through a court proceeding. The only thing I worry about with mental health is a third of the public's on Prozac. I don't think that's probably a good thing, but it's true. And so everybody on Prozac isn't crazy and shouldn't have their Second Amendment rights. So you have to be careful that it has to be, to my mind, a court proceeding. And I'm fine with taking Second Amendment rights away from people who committed felonies and from people who probably have committed some sort of crime to get before a court for a mental judgment. And some people have differing agreements on that. We are going to try to get some people into shelters. Some people don't like the new law, but if they don't get into shelters and keep doing the same thing, there will be some sort of legal penalty, which also might mean removing their Second Amendment if they're convicted while getting a lawyer. Is any of this perfect? No, but sometimes we also get carried away with the AR-15 when most of the crimes committed are handguns, and most of them are stolen. There's a lot of things going on. I think mentorship is an incredible thing. Whether it's black, white, or whatever, dads are important. And we have less of them of all races now. We have less intact families. But once again, I can't legislate that. I can't make people get married. I can't make them wait to have kids. I'm probably even bossing my own kids around. But those things are not to say they're not important. And I think they're incredibly important to have those role models in every community. And I think the lack of that is added up generation after generation for us. And like I said, I think that goes across racial boundaries. There's a lot of problems with absent parents.
Senator Paul, my name is Ken Grossman, and first I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today. That's wonderful, and for your service. My question, I didn't submit this question, but it's probably appropriate that I would be asking this because I think you'll know where I'm going with this. I'm a product of the Jefferson County Public Schools. I graduated from Ballard High School. My boys graduated from Male and Manual, and I recently found out that President Lori is also a graduate of Ballard High School. So we all turned out okay. But what I want to know, I know you've come out in favor of Amendment 2, and I would like to get your thoughts of the purpose of that and how we're going to benefit from Amendment 2.
So the first thing to know about Amendment 2 is that it doesn't do anything legislatively. It doesn't take any money from public schools. It's an amendment that, if passed, not $1 will change hands from the amendment. The amendment allows the state legislature to discuss and pass legislation concerning things like vouchers or special programs. So it doesn't take money away. Many of the people who've been arguing against it, at least in my community, all work in the school system, and they, to me, have somewhat of a conflict of interest in the sense that they're voting against competition. In Louisville, there's more of a dire need for this than anywhere else. And I have nothing against public schools. I went to 12 years in public schools. In my public high school, I had calculus, physics, dissection, anatomy and physiology, chemistry 1, 2, biology 1, 2. We had an amazing public school. My kids went to public school in Bowling Green. So people have to hopefully take this that I'm not against public schools. 45 to 48 states already have programs that involve some of this. It's usually not everybody gets it. It's usually actually for lower income people that get it. And in almost every one of those states, they actually find that spending on public schools goes up and salaries go up. Why? Because if I come into Louisville and all of a sudden through vouchers I take 2,000 of your students, the price of public schools per pupil actually goes down because they're taking away a smaller amount of money. It's smaller than what we spend. When that money goes away and the students are going away, the public schools become more competitive and pay their teachers more to try to keep them and to keep them from jumping ship and going to these other schools. We know this In Florida, compared to Kentucky, we used to be ahead of Florida in statistics, and it's reversed now. Florida's had a voucher program for probably 20 years. There's thousands and thousands of primarily African Americans, but whites also, but primarily African Americans that are taking advantage of the voucher system are doing better. If you look in Jefferson County, you can say, oh, my high school's good, I went there, and this. I can say the same thing. My kids went to Bowling Green High School. But if you look at the statistics for Jefferson County, they are alarming and they are dismal. For the whole city, 30% of the city reads at grade level. But if you want to isolate out just the poorer parts of Louisville, you're probably talking about 10 or 15% are reading at grade level. So we've known this is a problem for a long time. We tried through busing, we tried putting people together, we tried all kinds of things. None of it has really worked. And so I think we've got to try something different. The people who are all opposed to it are from an industry that is a government-protected industry. They don't want the competition. At least that is my explanation of it. And it's a difficult road because those people here's kids went to public school and they like their public schools and they think this is an attack on them. To me, it'll be for a limited people. My guess is anything the legislature passed, my kids are grown now, but my kids probably wouldn't have qualified. And many of you, their kids won't qualify either. It would be for poorer kids to try to give them a chance. But I think that competition, we need to try something different. I mean, I think that education is the civil rights of our era. I mean, it is the civil rights issue of our era. Education is your best means to escape poverty and escape everything else. And we've let down a lot of these kids. And I'll give you an example. I went to a public charter school. I've been to a bunch of these schools in Philadelphia called Boys Latin School. It's in a very, very poor part of Philadelphia. 99 out of 100 of the kids were African American. Every one of those young men got up, looked me in the eye, shook their hand, and 99 out of 100 went to college. It's just a phenomenal success. In the local public school, drug-infested, violence, like 10% are going. And this doesn't mean I hate public school teachers. I got members of my family who are public school teachers. And I met a teacher today here who said she's for it. So I don't think it has to be one or the other, that we hate public schools or we don't want everybody to go to private school. I think we've got to try something different for these kids that are getting a rotten deal and aren't going anywhere.
Senator Paul, thank you for being here. My name is Louis Seeger, Club Director in Commercial Lending with Park National Bank. Tax reform in 2017 led to unprecedented levels of manufacturing job creation, wage growth, and capital investment. But our progress is at risk. Devastating tax increases are scheduled for the end of 2025. We touched on this briefly earlier. What is your position on removing and extending these pro-growth tax policies?
I'm all for renewing them, and I think it will be devastating. It'll be essentially like $1 trillion tax increase. When they expire, you're going back to the old rates, and that's going to be $1 trillion higher. So I think it'll be devastating to our economy. One thing that's not going up, which is good news, is C Corps are down to 21%. Theirs became permanent. Because of the quirks of what's called budget reconciliation, the others had to expire. Not because we wanted them to expire, we were stuck by the way the rules are written that they're going to expire. And this once again becomes a partisan thing. There are no Democrats, not one, in Congress for renewing the tax cuts. Zero. It was passed by only Republicans. And to get them back would have to be, Republicans would have to have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Might happen. If it's divided government, you may get some of them back. For people who can organize both ways, this is the only bit of it. I'm not a financial advisor, but if you're an S Corp, which a lot of small businesses are, you have a 20% pass-through deduction now, and it was helpful. You know, Ron Johnson was a big part of getting that in the bill because C Corps got such a good cut. We want to make sure S Corps did so it wasn't changing over. But if the C Corps stay at 21, you get rid of your S Corp deduction. There might be a consideration people have to ask their accountant, should I become a C Corp? I don't know how hard it is to go back and forth. I am hopeful, but as I speak now, I think it's a very partisan issue on whether those tax cuts expire. To me, it's like, you know, who is more efficient with the money? There's the productive economy, and I think I'm looking at you, and then there's the non-productive economy, and that's government. I want government to have less money. There has to be some. I want government to be as small as is humanly possible to do and interfere in as few as things does. But the tax cuts are going to expire, and it depends on what the results of the election are, where they stay. I'm for keeping them. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Senator, for being here. We really enjoyed getting to know your team as well. Appreciate your visit to Rotary. Appreciate the speakers committee for compiling those questions and asking our senator those questions. Appreciate the Rotarians for submitting those questions. It was a very, very robust conversation. As I spoke briefly about last week, we have started an incentive program to increase member engagement at Rotary. There are some details about it in Sparks, so I encourage you to look at that. Delene is going to send out an email tomorrow, or at least before the end of this week, by next week, that has very detailed instructions on how you can earn those points. We will be drawing the winner at the end of the 6 months. So the 6 months ends on March 31st of 2025. And sometime in early April, we will be drawing the winner. That person will be able to win an all-expense trip, reasonable of course, but all-expense trip to Rotary International 2025, which is going to be held in Calgary in Alberta, Canada in June. So I hope you guys will pay attention to that. When we have more time in future meetings, we also will go into some more of the details. And of course, I can answer any questions. Delene can answer any questions, and our board members as well, because they're the ones who approved it at the last board meeting. So look forward to that for the magic of Rotary. Next week's meeting will feature Nick Camposano, founder and CEO of Zio. We will also have the honor of hearing from our district governor, Dale Leatherman. Dale is from Hopkinsville, and he is District 6710 governor for now, and he spends this entire year visiting all of the different clubs in his district, and next week, October 10th, is our chance to also hear from him as well as our speaker. Please RSVP by Monday, October 7th at noon, or you can scan, of course, the QR code on the screen. Please note that our club president-elect Ken Salvaggi and Executive Director Delene Taylor will be gone next week, so help me in hosting our speaker and our district governor, please. I'll need a little extra support. They're going to be traveling to Memphis for the large club conference. I got to do that as president-elect last October. It was in Baton Rouge, and I will tell you, it was just a really wonderful introduction to what it means to be a large club and what it means for you, Ken, as you begin to prepare for being president, not that I'm counting down, but on July 1st of 2025. Guests, as a reminder, I will want you to meet Craig Sherman at this table for just a few minutes when we're finished. And I wanted to say Shana Tova and Happy New Year. Rotarians, please enjoy the rest of your week.